Okay, can everyone hear me? I can speak really loud and fast, so I probably don't need this in front of me, but I will, for purposes of recording, I think, stand here and deliver my initial couple of thoughts. I hope I'm on topic. If I'm not, just wave your hand and tell me to steer left or right. But I understand that we're here talking about leadership and the role of innovation and how things need to change and adapt. Have I got a thumbs up on that? Good. Just a bit of background on me. I recently completed my PhD and I did it here at the University of Canberra. My topic was around managing by design, or that was a term that I coined to particularly look at the idea of public management and what it's doing differently, and in particular how design thinking might be employed in public management context to actually solve some of the challenges and problems, much what the speaker was talking about before. In particular, I focused on one particular case study in the public sector. I looked at the Australian Taxation Office and what practices they've been doing over the last decade. But my point of introduction is not so much to talk about that organisation, but more broadly about some of the more global trends happening around public management, and in particular the interest around the fusion between the practices of working differently and then getting the results that you need, which should be part of the mandate that you have as leaders. There's a couple of key points I wanted to raise around the realities of how we work, which is that some of the things we're talking about are quite in some sort of more kind of the academic terms of sort of the postmodernist type organisations that need to be employing different ways of working, which whilst we have lots of theories and papers that espouse these things, we don't necessarily see them in practice. So some of these sort of aspects around embracing collaborative practices, those words roll off our tongues quite easily, but we don't necessarily know how to actually behave in those sorts of ways in the day-to-day of the work that we do, whether you're an APS level, a management, mid-management level, or you're very senior manager. The actual practice of collaboration are yet to be fully realised across the board. But it is about recognising the different power hierarchies that exist in our formal roles and responsibilities, which we're all tied to and are measured against those. But when we talk about innovation and design thinking, it's about challenging some of those, not breaking them down and saying they don't exist, but saying let them exist for their various purposes, but then actually reframe how we actually relate with each other to actually work through complex problems. And it's also about creating an environment for experimentation, which is a term that might be more widely, bit of both really, used in other contexts. It's not necessarily something that we find as a term of reference in public management, in the day-to-day public management sense. So some of these sorts of themes are areas in which where people are making some improvements, whether they're small or large scale, they're prepared to do things a bit differently and try a few things. But they're probably the opening comments I'll make, and I'll hand over.
I'll just also announce there are actually the other talks happening in the other two rooms for the people that wanted to go and see them. So just take 30 seconds now if you want to shift into the other rooms. It's as per the two unconferenced lots of sessions that are happening in the back, and this is the academic panel. So this will be running for the next hour, and then everyone comes back to this room at 3 o'clock for the leadership panel, which is a single stream happening in this room. So if you want to take a couple of minutes to shift, please do, or 30 seconds to shift, and we'll continue on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Pia, and thanks for the invitation to participate this afternoon. For those that don't know me, my name is Michael Phillips. I manage what's called the e-government cluster at NICTA. It's a pretty ugly name, but I think we perform a pretty useful function. For those that don't know, NICTA is what was originally called the Centre of Excellence for ICT in Australia. It's a company set up to advance Australian technologies. It has about 800 researchers and a group of business people looking to engage with industry sectors to use the innovations that NICTA may develop or direct research from the real needs of those industry sectors. My particular focus is around government. I've been in and around government ICT for 30 years. I was a public servant and I've been in the private sector for 20 years and have some practical experiences around government uptake of ICT. One of the things we see, and you'd expect this as a taxpayer, that government is very judicious about the use of our taxes when it comes to acquiring ICT. On the other hand, we think there's also lots of opportunities for innovation. So the trick is, how do they balance the need to spend money wisely and also to explore new ideas to potentially deliver productivity benefits. The e-government cluster, which is the organisation I manage, is essentially a collaboration mechanism. We collaborate through a community of interest, we collaborate through a range of communication channels, and we collaborate by establishing projects where we bring together agencies, research, industry, to explore new ideas in a practical way within procurement guidelines, to get agencies understanding what's possible, what's not possible, to inform subsequent decisions about the choices they make. And we think this is a sensible mechanism because it engages the right people with real business problems. And I think we've heard from everybody today that increasing collaboration, I think, is an essential approach as we face this really, I think, pivotal period where we're seeing ICT just morph at warp speed. The requirements, the demands from citizens, from employees, just evolving so rapidly. And how does government respond to that in a meaningful and timely way? So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Next, I might invite Sulette to give a few minutes, and then Lachlan will have for a few minutes, and then we'll start doing Q&A. Oh, you're going to do slides?
No, not slides, just
Okay.
notes, just notes. Hopefully I'll sit here with the other one. Talk about ICT working together. I'm Sulette Dreyfus. I'm a research fellow from the University of Melbourne. My background, just briefly, is actually as a professional journalist. I worked as a newspaper journalist on the Herald Sun, don't hold it against me, before I went into academia and research. And I do research in the Department of Computing and Information Systems. One of my areas of interest is in citizen engagement and also in integrity systems. So I thought I just wanted to talk briefly about two issues that were near and dear to me. One of them was about trust, and trust has come up a bit today in terms of, I think Minister Lundy talked about resistance to change in organisations. And that's about, in a sense, I think the public service trusting the public. And then there's also the issue of the public trusting the public service. So I want to take a bit of a straw poll. We've done some research, among other things, on whether Australians and other people think that too much information is secret in organisations. And I'm interested to know what your thinking is. We've done a news poll on this with 1,200 randomly sampled Australians. And we asked them three questions, which one they agreed with. First was, in Australia, is about the right amount of information kept secret in organisations. The second was, in Australia, is not enough information kept secret in organisations. And the third was, in Australia, is too much information kept secret in organisations. So if I could see a show of hands for how many of you thought that, say 75% of Australians thought that just the right amount of information was kept secret in organisations. Who would have thought maybe 75% or so, 75% of the population thought that? Okay, who would have thought about, say, 50% of the population would have said, about the right amount of information is kept secret in organisations? Yeah, a few more hands, yeah. Who would have thought about 25% of people would have said about the right information, about the amount was kept secret? Yep, so that last group of people, you are right on the money. About 25% of people in Australia think the right amount, think that there is the right amount of secrecy of information in organisations. But Australia actually fares better than some other countries we looked at, like the UK, which is less at, I think it's 22%, and Iceland, which was at 15%. So that says there's a real hunger, a public hunger for information to be less secretive, less tied up in organisations. And made more public. And that's something that I think engenders trust. There's one other thing I just wanted to say was a quote from one of the founders of Transparency International, Jeremy Pope, who died unfortunately last year. But he said something quite interesting, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. He said, if our objective is transparent, accountable, and honest governance, government we can trust, and a private sector that is trustworthy, then clearly the less information that is kept from us, the greater the confidence we have in its accuracy, the more likely we are to achieve our aim, transparency has become a substitute for trust. I think it's something we're thinking about. I'm actually writing a book chapter on that topic. I haven't concluded yet whether or not I agree with it or whether it's just a component of trust. But I think it's worthwhile thinking today, when we look at all the engagement technologies, and that's what they are, that are being talked about today, that have been developed at Govhack, and hopefully we can continue that dialogue in a Q&A session on the panel.
And finally, Lachlan.
Thank you. Good afternoon all, and apologies for my late arrival. I suppose to give you a sense of my background, I've spent a lot of time at university studying, doing PhD, and I still hold an adjunct position at the ANU as a lecturer. But I've also had quite a bit of background around innovation itself. So I've worked in private equity, I've helped set up incubators, one in Canberra. I do a lot of work with startups, and when I'm not at ANU, most of my life is actually spent within startups, either growing my own or working with other entrepreneurs. So it's really fascinating to be able to talk at an event like this, because my view on the world has always been that it's only when government, academia and industry sort of come together that we actually have the opportunity to better society for all. And I know everybody has their individual views on government and on the role of industry and whether it's too strong, and academia and potentially what relevance it has sometimes. But from my perspective and what I've seen over the last few years, I'm not a native Canberran, but I consider Canberra home now, and I've been here since 2007, is that I've seen organisations and events that look to embrace that triumvirate that have actually made things happen. And my own personal experience with that was a business planning competition that a group of us set up 2007, and it's still running today, called Innovation ACT. And I mention this only because it's been the one experience I've had that's shown me the value of that, of the organisations working together. And it was nothing particularly innovative in what we were doing. We set up a business planning competition, very, very similar to the vast many that are out there. And it embraced elements of things like Govhack, weekends set aside to innovate, to exchange ideas and whatnot. But I think the value that it had was that it created an open forum for business, government and academia to come together and to share ideas. And in the context of what we're talking about today, the thought that I suppose I'd like to bring up, and then we can continue in the discussion, is simply that the way I see the world in terms of change and how we have to, how we're able to incorporate new things into the way that, into the status quo, is that we firstly need to actually recognise the importance of it. And in the context of recognising the importance of innovation in government, I think it's kind of a no-brainer. I think we're already there. I think that we broadly accept the premise that it's really important, that it's going to deliver benefits. I think the second thing is we then have to have the aspiration to want to be able to innovate in government. And I think we're getting there. I think there's sort of a messaging issue around it. I think innovation in government needs to be sexier. Innovation sounds sexy, and then we put government on the end, and everyone's like, oh, it's a bit of a shame. But practically, that shouldn't actually be the case. I do a little bit of consulting for a firm in Sydney around big data analytics, and at the moment, we're solving a problem about bread in New Zealand, and it sounds terribly dry. And on the outside, it is that way, but on the inside, it's actually not. It's really interesting work, and I think this is where innovation in government has the potential to be the same thing. We're so turned off potentially by the thought of innovation and government together that we forget that actually being able to innovate in government is something that's fundamentally interesting, is going to affect all of us when we are successful. And my third and final point is simply that once we recognise the importance and we aspire to actually do it, we actually need the opportunity to innovate in government. And for me, that's the most powerful idea of how we actually connect people both within government and those outside of government to actually allow us the opportunity to offer skills and expertise that don't currently reside in the public sector into the public sector in an effective mechanism. So I'll leave you with those three thoughts, and I look forward to the questions that will follow. Thank you.
Okay, so what we might do is we've got a microphone which our panellists should have, and so we might just pass over to you guys. Do you have any questions for our panellists, including particularly for Ian from his talk from earlier? Mick. I might just repeat the question for the live stream. So the question is about the relationship between power and leadership, and whether leaders have to be powerful in a hierarchical sense, or what is the relationship between them and, in order to get the balance. Is that a fair assessment? So we'll pass over to our panellists.
Hi. There you go. It's a really good question. I mean, one of the things that I think I might have mentioned it, but there's actually I didn't mention it, but I went to a concept around this. A CSIRO scientist said to me earlier in the year that if you've got a complex and dynamic system that's changing, the best adaptation is to be adaptable and agile, and to be attuned to all of the things happening on the edge of that system, to look for early and weak signals of change. But if your system is stable and predictable, then you can have the best adaptation is to specialise. And I think our systems and structures in the public service have been developed over some time in a more predictable and stable environment where the rate of change was less than it is today. So you'd have to question, given some of the things I was talking about, that rapid pace of change, that explosion in population, the pace of technology, you'd have to say that our systems need to become more adaptive to the environment that we find ourselves in. And certainly from the work that we do on leadership, it's very much about how do you engage every single person in the organisation in this exercise, because it's not sufficient to have all of the decision making at the top of the organisation, because you'll create bottlenecks, you simply won't have the capacity to deal with it, and you're probably even likely to miss some of the critical issues. So my boss says, as a commissioner says, it doesn't make sense to elevate decisions to the level where to the level of people who have the least capacity to deal with them. So I think we're probably similar page.
Just a quick comment. There was an ABS report published a couple of weeks ago, which essentially said, I'm not quoting it exactly, that an organisation will be innovative throughout. It's generally the case that one section may try to be innovative, but if the whole organisation isn't, it's probably not going to be successful. I guess my experience would be if the powerful management are on board, then it's going to be much more quickly to innovate, much more quick to innovate, than if it's an organic thing, from the ground up.
Yeah, my take on it would be that there's an adage in sort of the startup world that A people hire A people. And I think good leadership is the ability to let go of power and control over all areas of a project or a decision and things like that. So you can demonstrate leadership by removing yourself as the blockage from the critical path. And I think that people shouldn't be afraid of the fact that they don't necessarily have their fingers in every single pie that's underneath them, for want of a better analogy. It's good enough to show the leadership that you actually appointed the right person to lead the project on your behalf for the benefit of others.
Thank you. Okay, I'll add another couple of comments to the question raised. Just another bit of background on me. I did mention at the start, I'm also a partner in a consultancy firm, so I spend a lot of time applying these theories and ideas. So the good thing is it's not just a theory behind, but what it means. I just want to raise a couple of concepts around the power and leadership sort of debate or the relationship. And there's something about the shifting notion of what we mean by your power base as leaders. So in picking up the points around being more adaptive rather than fixed, There's a lot of healthy thinking in that leadership space. Jean Lydekker is an academic in the States who has some good models around thinking about the adaptive leader rather than the fixed leader, the analytic leader. But there's something about moving the sort of point of reference from being the director and decision maker to the enabler or the facilitator. And so we're seeing that in the more progressive organisations across the public sector, where senior leaders are suspending moments of their normal jurisdiction to be the facilitator and the enabler and the coordinator of many different perspectives, and finding moments in their work to deep dive into particular moments of bringing together different levels and experience points so they can actually challenge the current space that they're having challenges in. So it's suspending the need to worry about your role, but looking at the problem and opportunity that's really getting your attention and galvanising a cross-section of people, not just within your organisations, but external to them, so that the power debate's not necessary because you're actually trying to solve a very wicked and seriously complex problem. So for me, I think it's a balance of seeing in practice people's ability to actually balance an and, not an or. So you still need to maintain some of those understandings of power and structure, but then knowing there are important moments when that's actually not necessary.
So I was thinking about the comments made earlier by John Sheridan about power tending to be sucked upward over time in an organisation. And in many ways, I look at a government 2.0 movement, a movement towards open government, more freeing of information to the public, not just to other departments, as being potentially a protective, indeed a defensive mode for people who aren't necessarily at the top of an organisation. So if you're in a government department and it's not the most progressive or innovative, and you're somewhere in the middle or down the bottom, but you want to do innovative things, how do you go about it if your management isn't serious about it? I would actually suggest that if you are engaged in serious open government with the community, with stakeholders, it is protective in the sense that you will be able to calibrate what you are working on with the environment that's outside. And provided you can get a trust relationship with those people, that looks to me like, that's how good policy is made, that's how good projects are developed. And then if you find that there perhaps isn't the support for the innovation later on, you've got this whole community of people who are outside government who are saying, hey, we've seen this great thing. We think it's wonderful. We're behind it. We're supporters of it. And in a sense, that can engender bravery at the top echelons of an organization where there might not otherwise have been some.
Brilliant. Let's go for another question. Please.
Yeah, I was wanting to talk about design thinking. Government, I work in the design and tax office, and it's very immature in the Australian government still, but the tax office is a little bit more mature than some other agencies, and that's showing through your mandatory design documents that you've got to have at certain levels of projects. But in terms of design thinking, in that step before when new policy is being created, and I'm experienced in the team that I'm in, it's a new policy team, and the other designer and I are sidelined very overtly. Where do you see that heading? Is it, you see it growing in the near future? Is it something that is quite a long-term goal? I mean, we see other governments such as the UK that's making some headway in open policy, but just that thoughts.
So my apologies to the people watching the live stream. The very, very brief version of trying to paraphrase that is, where is design going, thinking going in government?
Especially in policy development. So
especially in policy development, before the project even started. Okay, before the project's even started, please.
I will start this part of the response back, given where you're working is where I studied for a number of years, plus I worked there as well, so I can actually understand the application of design. It's actually a topical point globally around where design is playing a role in breaking down the barriers between some of those quite traditional hierarchies and boundaries of where different things are done. So policy design is done, usually by some other players in certain parts of the system. Some organisations have it integrated, but not many. And there's actually a book that we're writing, a chapter at the moment, that's actually trying to talk about the cases where design is playing a role in influencing policy. I think there's a different meaning of the word policy and policy formulation depending on the country that you're in. There's some different definitions of that in Europe compared to here. But I think part of it is actually knowing the boundaries between the sort of the contested areas between where you're in the administrative role and in doing the interpretation and translation and the implications of those decisions in practice. Where are some of those relations that were just talked about in terms of the trust and the ability to have the dialogue that might just nudge the thinking in the policy space, not necessarily change it wholesale or make it go into field, co-designing, co-creating very systemic ideas initially. It might be between the way you operate at the very front end and then over time, how can you see improvement? But also, we've done a few projects with departments that have clear mandates. We are not the policy designers. We actually implement policy, and we'd like you to understand the policy in action, and then all we can make a call on will be the bits that we have jurisdictional right to do. And so in those sorts of projects, whilst we respect that contractual boundary, we still find that the avenues for systemic improvement are policy changes. And there are cases where we've actually recommended changes to policy frameworks, and that's actually brokered conversations between those agencies that actually are the administrators of that policy and the people that craft that policy. So sometimes it's about understanding the feedback loops between the system in action and between the sort of front end where it's first formulated. So I think it's an ongoing endeavour, and keep having the ability to build the relations so that people can start to see the relational impact between how it plays out in practice should influence the original design.
I'm very poorly qualified to answer a question about policy development, having never worked in government, but from the design thinking side of things, what I've seen when I have seen design thinking used is actually quite impressive. And I think it empowers people to be creative when you provide a different paradigm within which they can think. And so, I mean, I would hope that government is tending that way, but I think design thinking falls under it's just one of many possible different frameworks under which we can choose to think. And so, you know, I don't think we need to say we're implementing design thinking per se. I think it just needs to be a case of we're open to new ways of thinking about how we could better develop things. And policy at its heart is about solving a customer problem, right? We're trying to solve problems that society as a whole is facing. And so, you know, if we're not actually going out and thinking about the implications of that in a broader sense rather than from within an ivory tower, then I don't see how we're ever going to be able to solve the problems.
Just a comment that I think is sort of topical at the moment around design, and that's the issue of perceived failure. So rather than looking at different options, exploring it as a learning exercise, there's so much media and political scrutiny that is often portrayed as failure, and it tends to restrict the activities that would otherwise be in the interest of the public.
Thank you. A few points on that. I spent a lot of time in the private sector before I joined the public sector a couple of years ago. So that question of the degree of experimentation and risk taking is a very different proposition in the public sector to the private sector. The consequences of failure in the public sector are higher. In the banking world I was in, you know, if you got 80% of your judgment calls right, you're going to have a brilliant year on the bonus front. If you got 20% of your calls wrong in the public sector, it may not be so forgiving. But one of those challenges of leadership, as I said before, and this is about the risk appetite, creating an environment where risk can be taken. Lots and lots of pilots. There's many tools and processes that we have to create innovation and the space for innovation in the public service as well. And I've been involved with lots of them in different lives. But I would say in terms of the UK is doing some really great stuff. And if you're talking about the Behavioural Insights team at the Cabinet Office, is it that work, the Nudge Unit and other? No, okay. Well, we're very much connected with some of the innovative thinking in the UK, and in fact New South Wales has taken one of the people from that team, which we're into their organisation, and we're engaged with them as well. But it's just trying to get really different perspectives on the way we think about policy and policy development, and abandoning some of the assumptions that have served us well that may not serve us well in the future. So I'll stop there.
I might just use the privilege of the chair to just throw in 3 quick things as well. First of all, getting your technical people involved early in the process I think is useful, but having a cross-disciplinary approach, asking your existing policy people to use completely new methods is a bit tricky, but trying to actually take cross-disciplinary teams to actually come up with new ways to achieve sort of problems I think is a useful thing. Second of all, using the people, so the people publicly and the people internally. There's always more skills internally than you're aware of that you could be leveraging. And there's always, I always say that transparency is the public service's best defence to getting the best evidence-based policy. Because if we develop our policy openly and transparently, we can get more input, we can get broader perspective, we can get peer review, and that's a good way to develop it. But the final thing is iterative policy development, understanding that policy does need to change over time, and being able to measure, monitor, come up with recommendations and feed back into, and constantly have an evolving iterative approach to your policy, I think is really important, particularly in some areas. There's my 3 thoughts. Anyway, oh sorry, we had a question just up the back first.
Do you think it's time that government organisations have a chief innovation officer?
Do you,
So, what will be the description of the position?
So for the live stream, do they think that it's time that government's had a chief information officer, and if so, chief innovation officer? I was about to say we have information officers. Okay, chief innovation officer, and if so, what would be a description for the title?
My view is that I'll give you a long answer and then a short answer, I suppose. But I think it's dangerous to indicate a change in direction by appointing someone without addressing the underlying cultural issue that's there. So having a chief innovation officer, in theory, I think is fantastic in that it draws a line that says that yes, now innovation is important. But if that one person does not affect the potentially tens of thousands of people who are implementing policy and working in the public sector, then it's actually a really terrible thing, because it draws a line in the sand that makes us think that things will then be innovative, but doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to deliver on that. So the approach that, so I suppose the short answer to that is not necessarily. The thing that I would prefer to see is I would prefer to see government having the ability to engage broadly with the innovation sector that falls outside of the outside of government. So, a personal hate of mine is that you hear about projects that blow out of all proportion, and there's vast amounts of money there. And I work with startups for whom $50,000 to $100,000 is the difference between being able to do something or not being able to do it. So, I would prefer to see something like a percentage of the budget allocated to innovation, 1 or 2% that's at risk. Because realistically, you look, Queensland Health have put in a new payroll system. They put out a $6 million tender, and it's now $500 million, and it still doesn't work. Now, I know nothing about payroll systems, but I reckon that a good team of startups, a good team of entrepreneurs could have had a pretty good crack at it, and I don't think it'd be anywhere near $500 million yet. So, to me, I think it's a broader cultural change that's necessary, and I think if you have the innovation officer, that's going to come from the top, whereas if you have a percentage of budget allocated to actually implementing innovative projects, it's going to be implemented throughout the hierarchy, because there's going to be lots and lots of different touch points. And so all of a sudden, instead of one person responsible for it, you have many, many thousands of people who are actively responsible for ensuring that innovation is working within government. So, sorry, my 2 cents.
I don't know whether I should be a controversial panellist and say that's wrong. No, just joking. Trying to work it out if we should be interacting here or just talking at you. It's going through my brain. I probably want to maybe put a point of it depends as well, to agree, which is what's the product life cycle of innovation in your organisation? Does it exist? Does it not exist? What's the footprint of activity wherever it is in the organisation? Because in my own research, it was critical to have a champion to say we have to operate work differently. Now, a champion doesn't have to reside in one person or one fancy title. I think that's true. I think it needs to be carefully thought through. Imposing or impregnating some foreign object in an organisation that has some branding identity which the organisation treats with a bit of disgust is not helpful. But the emphasis should actually be in, well, what should be different? And also, what's the vision for that championship? So in my own case study, talking to the tax case study, I worked there in early 2000 when it was sort of kicking off. There was constantly this mantra, it's a 10-year journey. So the difference then became, well, what are we setting up over 10 years? Which does align to the previous person's point. Lachlan. So it is a case of saying, what do we expect to see as the footprint of things happening? So in my research, in the end of the day, when I said, well, what's there? Can you see different practices happening? There was different levels of management implicated in being champions of doing things differently, whether it's innovation, design, whatever the term is that your organisation most happily digests. So in another organisation I'm working with, one's on this side of the Tasman, same organisation on the other side of the Tasman, debating whether we should use the word customer as a term in the organisation. We don't have customers, we've got stakeholders, we've got clients, we've got this, we've got that, and you think, well, let's not have the debate over that term. One side of the Tasman said, well, we're not going to have that term, and we're certainly not going to have a senior customer manager that deals with insights and innovation, where the other side of the Tasman said, we've just appointed a customer senior manager and they're going to be driving the insights. Same jurisdictional role, different sides of the Tasman, different arguments for it. Are they both trying to innovate, come up with things differently, work within tighter budgets? Absolutely. They just have to find the right formula for their organisation. So I think it needs to be a sophisticated understanding of your vision of the organisation and building the networks of champions who can say, yes, I'm going to model a way of doing something differently.
Coming from the IT sector, I fear that the risk would be, people would be thinking about that role as an ICT role. And I don't know if Jane Treadwell has spoken yet, but one of her famous quotes is, there's no such thing as an ICT project. There's always business projects with varying degrees of ICT. And I think, the innovation really can come from or be required in many areas. It could be in people development, it could be in process, it could be in tools. So it's a pretty tough ask for that to be led by one person, which leads me to the culture of innovation. I think is really important.
So I think it goes back to that it depends argument. I'd like to think that every agency head in the Australian Public Service is a Chief Innovation Officer, but also just more generally that every person in an organisation is a source of innovation as well. To have a separate kind of title and position, you have a risk of innovation happening that's not connected to the problems of the organisation to some degree, but you can collectively get around the notion that we've got Jane's area in the APS, for example, and we've got a Department of Innovation more generally, who can provide tools and processes, ways of thinking, help us development. We in the Public Service Commission can help to develop those capabilities in people, but I don't think we're going to have chief innovation officers in the public service in the future.
So I'm going to go against the grain here and actually say I could see a role for it, but I'd need to be clear that the role would be one that was largely about marketing and sales. And that is as much to the general public and a little bit of reframing their thinking essentially on risk-taking and willingness to accept failure sometimes when you innovate. But also a role of marketing and promotion within the civil service, within public servants' own mind. So again, the comments this morning, I think from John Sheridan around essentially telling people to be brave, provided you work within a set of constraints. You can go out and do things as long as you can be accountable for them. You're willing to step up to the plate. And sometimes having one person who is, in a sense, that role model, or that person who tells you, yes, you can do it. Go tackle it, is all you need to be, the tipping point that someone needs to actually engage in, taking the risk involved in introducing a bit of innovation in their corner. And so for that reason, I could see it would have some value.
Okay, we've got a question down the front here.
I just wanted to make, hi, thank you everybody. I just want to make a follow-up question on one of the comments that was made regarding design thinking and iterative innovation approaches to policy development. And when you talk about ICT and ICT-related startups, you can see very quick iteration with innovation. But in policy, you can't really put something on hold and have one part of the population subject to a certain policy that's being trialed while another is still being implemented. So what would iterative cycles look like on a time frame? What would be reasonable for policy development or design thinking in policy development?
So what would be a reasonable timeframe for iterative policy development?
To actually achieve impact.
To achieve impact.
All right, they want me to do it. I've got the courage, let's go. Well, I think it is a balance of actually saying where is there the opportunity to say what might be the shortest, fastest way we could actually do something. And I think there's something about going from the generalities to some specifics. So is there a specific program with a specific impact on a specific group of people within the community that we can zoom in on to say there actually is a container here that we could try something a bit more really focused way, try a few cycles of something different. So one of the things I think we get into a trap when we talk about these concepts is that we think too big scale, we think everything, we think whole of government innovation, whole of government this, bring it right down to there are many, many programs that we deliver across government. So whether you're zooming in on health, whether you're zooming on a particular type of health program, whether you're zooming then in on a particular type of service group within the community, whether it's Indigenous or whether it's a certain type of health condition we're trying to actually zoom in on. I suspect if we actually thought through some of those sorts of more specific aspects, we might be able to find, a 6 to 12 month cycle that we could do something differently in, but we really use it as a way to experiment and almost use it as a microcosm of what might be. So we're more open and transparent about the process rather than trying to do it in sort of skunk work style, which I hear that term and I shudder, quite honestly, because I think that's not helpful from a learning point of view and a cultural shift point of view. But that would be my hypothesis, to answer your question, that if we really just went right in deep, we could find some isolated pockets that could actually be more containers of trying things differently and working with industry and trying some startups, throwing some people in to say, solve this problem. I think we've got a back-end big architecture to design. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe it's a simple interface that we need for this. That's my response.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it's we have to agree eventually. I think it has to be wild before you know the impact of policy, because no one you don't know the game until people are playing it, and that's what policy is. Policy sets a framework within which we as a population try and optimise, and so you can only simulate that so effectively without knowing how everything else is going to impact. As someone who sees the effect of government policy, you see it very, very quickly. So, I'll hear it on ABC, and then I'll see it, you see it within a couple of months, because that's the reporting cycle typically that certainly in the business environment, that's the reporting cycle I see back to government. And so I know what it's like, because all of a sudden things change, or I'm paying more money for this, or I need insurance for this, or things get better. Like back in the day, GSD coming in, say it was a really significant opportunity because it levelled the playing field. It took away sales tax, and it actually made small businesses quite competitive again, because it meant that you were buying at the same rate as everybody else was. So I think it's obvious quickly. I think the challenge though is accepting that policy could actually roll back. All right. So if you think about ICT innovation particularly, right, when they put out a new interface to a piece of software, a new website, and it's terrible, they change it. They just roll it back to the previous version. But governments don't routinely roll back policy to a previous version and say, oh, well, that was pretty terrible, let's have another crack at it. So I don't think it's not the ability to iterate, it's the willingness to iterate in a reverse direction that needs to change. And I think at that point it's fantastic. Then the community can provide comment on how it actually is implemented. And the feedback that's given can then be used to inform the change that could then follow.
I'm just going to, I guess, challenge the notion that you can't experiment with policy. It's a social policy as well. I was mentioned the Behavioural Insights team in the UK who are looking at really different ways of approaching problems which have had very traditional technical solutions. And one of the areas they went to work in was a job centre in a particular part of Wales. It didn't matter where it was. But basically, the old model was people came in, they ticked the boxes, which, pretended that they were kind of looking for work, and walked out, and nothing happened. There's nothing happened. So they just did work with they broke it into 2 floors, and the top floor they trained to have a more active co-creation. It's a really good understanding of the individual and the problem they're trying to solve. And it doesn't matter what the detail is, but they got dramatically improved employment outcomes for the people who went to the top floor, the people who went to the bottom floor, and so that's that's an experiment in a way, but it meant that that's something there was no harm done to.
How long was the cycle?
I don't know. It's a story from the Behavioural Insights team, but they were talking over a 6-month period. They were talking over a 6-month period where this changed way of working was leading to demonstrably better outcomes. But we have stories like that in our own Department of Human Services, where there's a lot more co-creation of outcomes at the front line, where instead of taking a long-term job seeker and empowering that person at the front line to say, what is the real problem here, and how can I have some resources how can I apply some resources to solve that problem? And there's a classic story of a guy who he needed to get a few things together in his life before he was in a position to be able to participate in the job-seeking process. So they put money into that and the supports around that. It was a much more active process with the local community, with the local, and this guy, the case study is the guy is now working and employing other people. And so there are lots of stories like that around too. But I think you can experiment in that space as well.
I'm just going to add one example just to trigger my mind, just to actually illustrate the point that I was raising before about the system versus the pieces in the system, and maybe thinking about working differently to understand. I think sometimes our experimentation doesn't have to start with the intent of trying to change policy, which is, I think, your point as well, Ian. So as a project at the moment, and if you actually go to Think Place website, there's a final report on here, but it's working with families high at risk in the ACT here. And that project actually went through an 8 to 10 week cycle originally, looking at creating the insights of change at the start. So it wasn't about trying to change any part of the system originally, but just trying to get underneath what was happening in terms of people's experiences and behaviours and needs. And then since around August of last year till about now, they've now been prototyping the actual service delivery model, which is actually fashioned much more on a co-development of their solution and needs to their systemic challenges, which has actually proven to be quite a fundamental shift in how we think about servicing people's needs. So rather than filling out a form and rather being a person and a number on a different multiple systems across the service system, actually having a different way to integrate from a person-centred point of view and how much more control those individuals actually have. So as a cycle of time, we're looking at really within a 12-month window, going from thinking about the insights that are driving some of the systemic issues, but then actually working with the system in co-developing what has to be different, rather than just sort of sitting back and conjecturing what might be, but actually evolving it and experimenting along the way. So there are examples here as well.
And just to add to that...
Hold on, live stream.
Just to add to that, the benefits for the people working in that environment are just incredible. To be working and actually helping to solve people's problems with them, working with them to solve people's problems, change the relationship from a power over relationship to let's solve this thing together. I haven't got the figures, but I would argue, well, if you're getting better outcomes for a start, so it's better use of public money as well.
I think it's also worth looking at things that are long-term policy versus very short. There are things such as dealing in an emergency where you want the policy of how you're engaging with people online to be learning on a daily basis and feeding back into the policy of how you're responding to people. So there's different types of policies out there. I might just throw a question to the panel. What part does the public play in the design of the government of the future? Go on, Sulu.
In a few words, I'd say hopefully a much bigger role than it has played in the past. I have worn in my previous life a bit of a hat of the community activist as well. I was involved in a campaign, I don't know if any of you were familiar with it, but in Fitzroy in Victoria there was a historic 100-year-old pool that was going to be closed and sold off by council to a developer to build apartment buildings. And there was a very major community outcry over this, with marches in the street and occupying the site and all the rest of it, and I was the core of that. In the end, we saved the day. And that was in 1994, and since then there have now been 1 million visits to that pool, and it is constantly rated on the annual surveys that the Yarra City Council runs as one of the most prized possessions of the residents of Yarra, which is the Fitzroy pool. So that was a very antagonistic relationship, because a decision was made that was clearly not engaging with the public. The beauty of the technologies that we've seen here today is that they are engagement technologies, and they provide a way of actually drawing in members of the community to incorporate them into the iterative processes of policy making, to pilots, that sort of thing, in a small scale way, in a very cost effective way, in a very time efficient and scalable way. And that is why this is so fantastic, because you can all of a sudden do this in a way that isn't involving someone having to sit in an office in Canberra and ring, 85 people 3 times a week to do some form of consultation. So I think it has to do a much deeper engagement than it has in the past, so that we don't have to occupy pool sites in order to save them. The risk is that if that isn't done, then you end up with angry electorates who take it out on governments, who ended up in taking it out on people who work for those ministers down below them. Or you get a very disengaged and unhappy electorate who don't trust. And that goes back to what I initially spoke about, in trust, is that it's very important to get trust reestablished between a citizenry and the public service. I was recently in Iceland, and one of the most important things that senior policy and other people involved there have said to me is that they have, as never before, seen that the people distrust their government. And that's because of the banking crisis and the failure of the banking system that happened. But they all realize, and all the people who work in the public service there realize, that it's going to be a long, hard road back. And that once lost, it takes much longer time to regain. So, there are, in a sense, 2 paths open to us. We can engage, and that means engagement between people in the community, NGOs, all the rest of it, and government at the ground up, or we can have this sort of adversarial relationship. And in the long run, the latter doesn't work.
I'll just add a couple of comments to that as well. There's something about the realities of where something has an immediate impact on people's day-to-day life, they're likely to have a high interest to want to be engaged. So something that they can physically see changing in their environment, such as a key artefact or a built environment concept that they can see that it's changing or going, there's a high degree of public interest. I think the challenge with publics being involved is the ability to think beyond the immediate that they can see a difference for, but a world that may not yet be lived. It's actually not here yet. And I think we have to check our assumptions about, the public's ready to be engaged. We're all part of the public. We want to be a part of different dialogues, but we're busy, we have different lives, so we need to be thinking about the ethics that relates to this whole relationship between us going out and reaching and pulling in. We have to understand to what difference is it going to make to citizens, because a lot of these experiments and engagements aren't about seeing something within a short, immediate cycle. They're actually a longer and more systemic than that. We do have the challenges of political cycles of every 3 or so years, and then what does that mean in terms of doing some of the changes that we need, and how do you find the citizens that perhaps are happy, or the industries that are happy to work knowing that things actually might have a short-term realisation and others won't. So I think having a sensitivity to these different cycles and different time dimensions, and I think it's encouraging dialogues that actually aren't adversarial or reacting to things that have been a decision. Don't like your decision, can we then negotiate a better outcome, to we haven't even decided yet, we don't even know what's happening, how might we do something different? So posing different questions into the public arena to stimulate different dialogues that aren't about an advertisement in a newspaper saying, if you've got ideas, come to the town hall and would like to hear from you. That really has to change. And if I could obliterate one question, what do you think? Please take that away today. Do not put something in front of someone, ask them what do they think. It's ridiculous. So think about your own experiences with life. If I said to you, how's this thing going to work every time you had to get in your car every day, I would give this thing and put it in your car, and every day that you got up and turned your key and got into your car, you can then tell me what do you think about this concept, because you've actually tried to use it in practice. So my one last comment would be, do not ask what do you think. It has to be a different dialogue.
Thanks. I'm going to sound like a little bit of an anarchist when I say this, and I don't actually mean to, but I think maintaining a healthy disrespect for the status quo is actually fundamental to citizenry actually moulding the government. So while I don't think, I would use the word adversarial, but not in the way that it has been used. So I'll use a different word, in that I think it's the responsibility of us as the population to not simply be consumers of policy that is created, but to provide ways to feed back information to government. And so, so GovHack's the perfect example of how you can do that. But I think we also need to understand that, ICT is not the one and only mechanism by which we can do that. So, if you don't happen to be a programmer or a data analyst, then, it doesn't mean that you can't give back to government. It means you give back to government in a different way. And so I think the way that we have to move towards is we as citizens have to be willing to stand up and say, no, I don't think this is right. And perhaps it would be better if. You can't simply, shouting at something to try and shout it down is not the solution. You have to probably come back with a counter proposal to some extent. And so we as a citizenry need to do that. Government, on the flip side, need to open the channels by which we can actually communicate back to government. So the fact is, if I wasn't a data analyst, how would I go back? So yes, I write a letter to my minister, or maybe, so it's cultivating an understanding of the conduits by which we can communicate back to government, and exposing. All of us have the ability and the skills to communicate in some form. We just have to be able to use the form most appropriate to us.
And I also look forward to the day when the citizenry say, I really like the way you did that, as opposed to...
Actually, that's a... Sorry, can I... I think that's an interesting point, actually. And I think, I think particularly for those who work in the public sector, too often the public sector only sees the negatives of what is going on. But in the same way that 90-something% of laws that pass through the parliament are actually bipartisan, the reason that we are not a particularly activist society is simply because public service is actually doing a pretty good job of giving us a pretty amazing country. And so, I think there are no conduits to give government a slap on the back though either. So if they wanted to create those, that would be good too.
Cool. All right, we might actually have to wrap it up there. Sorry, we've got another panel starting in 3 minutes, so I might just, if there's any last thoughts from the panel, you've got about 30 seconds each.
So my last thought was on this topic, whether we're at the cusp of a really significant change. On the one hand, open government movement and transparency and all that provides, and on the other, the rapid evolution of technology and mobility, breaking down jurisdictional boundaries, breaking down the boundaries between employees and citizens and business and government. It's all merging and becoming confused. So I'm not so sure that it's, actually it reminds me of I'm showing my age now, a movie called The Rise and Rise of Mr. Rimmer, if you ever saw it. It's kind of that era.
Just pick up on the same point about trust and confidence. It's always been central to the whether the public service exists at all. It has to have the trust and confidence of the Australian people, and all the evidence is that it does. Remembering that the problems that we deal with, with the private sector hat on, you work in markets where you're going to win. You work in markets where you can be successful. In the public sector, the problems that we have to pick up are ones where, almost by definition, there's a market failure or a regulatory issue. But in terms of who providing the advice to political leaders, we're one source of advice in the public sector. Politicians inform themselves in many ways, so there's plenty of opportunities. For public servants, we do need to be across where citizens are at and how expectations are changing. But politicians inform themselves in many ways.
Probably said more than enough, but my last thought would simply be that I do think that we are trending in the right direction for incorporating more innovation in the public service and for making it a discussion that's broader than simply the public service in isolation. And so I think for that, everyone who's pushing towards that should be very, very proud. And I think in future it will change positively simply because we have a mindset that we want to head in that direction.
I think just go away thinking about your own opportunity to do something different. And I think whether it's an attitude or an approach to what you're working on, but also looking for the opportunities where they are, and actually having confidence in the broader system in terms of opportunities that are there. And I think keep involved and engaged and keep the conversation moving. And I think don't always think the answer's overseas. It should be here as well. So I think look for your own case studies to talk through.
And I'd say after you do that first step, the second step is find your allies. You know, a lot of you are probably in this room because you are the innovators in your organization. You've taken the time out to come today because you're trying to figure out, how can I be the innovator in my organization? So find your allies as a second step, whether that's in the organization, in a sister organization, another branch of government, or outside. And then ask them for help. Ask them to rally behind you. You know, ask them if they're a community group, say to them, if you think this is good policy, if you want it to be rolled out, if it's not a pilot, go to the Age, go to the SMH, say this is really good policy. Because if that sort of thing happens, then the senior decision makers will listen and they will accept the innovation.
Great. Okay, we'll wrap up now. If you'd all like to hold on 1 second and then join me, and then I'll ask our next panelists to please come up on the stage, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. So please join me in thanking this panel.